I am here, I'm so lucky, with my old professor and teacher, Mr. Kropf. And I know so many people right now are, there's a lot going on in the world and it's confusing. And is it cyclical? Is it systemic? And can you lay down what we had been discussing before about the cycle of things that kind of happen that you were discussing from that professor?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, this is based on the work of William Robinson. But of course, he bases his work on many other scholars and academicians that have come before him. And I guess if you wanted to follow the pedigree, it probably goes back to the 19th century, Karl Marx and his sort of explanations of capitalism and how it evolved out of feudalism, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, William Robinson, I think, is the one that's making the point that these type of crises can be divided into three types. And cyclical crises are ones that happen fairly often, but that are not really that detrimental to the system itself. In other words, it's like recessions, sometimes even depressions might come under a cyclical crises, problems with unemployment, and these things are usually things that are fixed, have political fixes, and politicians will come in and maybe bail out, this group or that group, and then things go on as normal. And then the next one up that he talked about is a structural crisis, and that's when the structure of the system itself has to much more radically change in order to survive. So William Robinson starts with a discussion of what he called mercantile capitalism, which is the type of capitalism that we experienced in the very beginning when the founders of the country started. And he talks a lot about Alexander Hamilton and his book or pamphlet, I guess you could say. It was called Report on Manufacturers. And mercantilism is kind of based on this idea that the government itself has to be involved in, helping, the country to kind of compete against other countries that it might not, have the ability to compete with. Like at the time, we weren't able to compete with Great Britain. We needed to kind of put a lot of effort. We needed to put a lot of resources into kind of building up our industry so that we could compete with Britain and France. But of course, around 1800, that gives way to what they call competitive capitalism. And that's a new stage where you start to see the growth of business and the expansion of the country westward. And that is characterized by a lot of small businesses that are, and it's a very sort of a risky situation because, in small business, there's nobody there to bail you out if you fail. And so but of course, at the end of the 19th century, in the late 1800s, now companies are realizing that if you can get the government to kind of help you, you can become much bigger, much stronger, and much more profitable. And that brings us into another structural type of capitalism called monopoly capitalism. And that's where corporations start to dominate the business world. And this is where small businesses start to really suffer because of the strength that corporations have and the connection they have to government. And that pretty much monopoly capitalism, I think, keeps us going up until about 1980. And at that point, the banks, because capitalism itself it becomes much more competitive and much more difficult to make a profit, then you start to see really the only money that can be made is through speculation. And so in the 1980s, we get this huge jump in what they call speculative capital. And that brings us into a new era, if you will, or a new structure of capitalism called financial capitalism. And financial capitalism is where really the banks are kind of taking the lead. And what do banks produce? They really don't produce anything. All they do is speculate and making guesses on currency changes and stuff like that. And that's why some have thought that this might be the sort of the final stage, if you will, of capitalism. And so that brings us to what Robinson calls a systemic change. And systemic changes, the last, I suppose, systemic change we had was about 500 years ago, as the Western world transitioned out of feudalism and into capitalism. But those kind of changes, really come, sometimes across thousands of years. Whether we're in a systemic change right now is just impossible to say, because when you analyze transitions between systems, what you realize is sometimes they take 200-300 years to kind of, show themselves, to turn over.
Yeah.
So in other words, if the systemic change started in the year, say, 1450 or 1500 AD, and didn't really resolve itself until 1700 AD, that's 250 years. So if you could say that if we're at the beginning of a systemic crisis, it might take quite a while before, I won't live to see living under another system. My son probably won't, but maybe his son will, or daughter. And so you really don't know.
That depends on how we can move this thing forward, right?
Well, that's the other thing too that I guess you have to keep in mind, is that if you study systemic changes, what you notice is as each systemic change kind of moves forward, as you go to the next one, that the time crunch becomes much smaller. And that might have to do with a whole host of factors, probably the spread of technology, the idea that we're kind of living in a global, kind of connected world where information, spreads very quickly.
The ability to communicate as quickly as we can, and then broadcast that out to friends and family, even.
Exactly.
Let alone friends and family and your immediate contacts, but then even more people are now exposed to it. It's just,
right.
It can be seen as system overload. However, it's freedom of information.
Right. And of course, the word that they use to describe this is globalization. Globalization became a very popular word in the 1990s, but that's essentially what it means, is the world is getting smaller and changes are occurring over a shorter period of time as a result of all these technological advances that we've experienced over the last 100 years. So, you think back to Gutenberg and the printing press, in the 15th century, and, how long did that take for things to get printed and ideas to get shared? And now we're living in a world where, we know what's happening in other parts of the world. And so that might be, compressing the time frame. So you're right. It is possible that we might see significant changes in the system in our lifetime. I guess I just would say that I wouldn't bet on it for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is systems don't change. I think that once systems kind of get into place, it is kind of hard to change them. I think that capitalism has sort of shown itself to be very adept and very flexible at making changes in the past. And so there's no reason why it couldn't do that in the future. I've heard a lot of people talk about, what they call green capitalism. In other words, we're going to be moving to this world where you're going to see an advancement in people's material lives, because we're going to get off the fossil fuel economy, and we're going to stop global climate change, and there's going to be all that. So whether that stuff is fantasy or whether it's real, and whether or not it can I guess sort of pull capitalism's fat out of the fire, if you will, again, because capitalism has had to structurally change over the last 300 or 400 years as a way to survive. And I suppose it could again. It's hard to say what that would look like or what would have to happen. Now, on the other hand, if it is a system change, then we might be moving into a world that is more socialistic. But, saying that, you have to be really careful, because when you look at socialist experiments that occurred in the 20th century, a lot of them did not turn out too well, and they became very authoritarian.
Right.
There was a lot of death and a lot of destruction. And of course, what's interesting is if you look back at the period where we transitioned from feudalism to capitalism, there was also a lot of turmoil. There was also a lot of death and civil war and violence. And that might be just sort of, I guess, just sort of part and parcel to the systemic change. But I kind of feel like this time we can't let that happen, because this time, we have a world that's brimming with nuclear weapons. We have, transnational terrorism. And so I think that if the system change, if it's occurring, ends up being violent, that's really not going to be good for anyone. And so we really need to kind of keep our eye on that too, and make sure that, you hear a lot of people say that, kill capitalism and, kill this and kill that. And it's like, no, this time we got to figure out, we got to use our heads and figure out a way to do this without killing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot, and this is something that I've been looking at over years, and I feel like, we had kind of touched upon this before we started recording, is that, this whole pandemic kind of seems like out of left field, and it where did it come from? But the truth is that there's been a big disconnect in media for several years. In fact, you were pointing it out when I was a junior in high school. You know what I mean? So
I remember.
Yeah, and so when all this stuff, and I've been looking at human trafficking and how it plays into the system, and all the things going on under the scenes that you just would never think are even possible. Right?
Well, when we talked about it, back in the early 2000s, I said that, one of the interesting things about the values that are embedded in capitalism is that you could find good things and bad things. And obviously, when you look, for instance, at the profit motive, which is so, an important component to capitalism, obviously the profit motive has, made life better for a lot of people, because it incentivizes people, people want to earn money, et cetera, et cetera. But like when you talk about human trafficking, that's a good way to make money too. So the problem, the problem is this dual nature of the profit motive that, can be harnessed, I think, to do good things, but it can also be harnessed to create a whole lot of problems.
Well, that also goes along with agenda, right?
Correct.
If the agenda behind whoever is profiting is not for the greater good of everyone involved, and that's not how they lay it out, because I know for me, when I'm coming up with my purpose and writing out my life map, the goal always has to end with it's for the greater good of me and everybody involved. So that's where like innovation comes in, and there are people, I know that free clean energy exists. We're just not getting it because it's being suppressed. Right. So if you take that out of the hands and go like, you can actually, if we start putting more value on innovation, in my opinion, allowing certain people, allowing their inventions to actually come to the free market. And I do think that we are in a time where I don't think that they're able to suppress it so much. And suppression has been a big part of human history. You ask most people and they're like, yeah, war, of course there's going to be war, and I just don't think we have to live in that type of environment.
No, I don't either. And I think that, kind of studying the theories behind war, about why wars get started, I think is an important part of that. I think that's why I've always enjoyed teaching international relations, so that you can look at the different reasons why, and one of the ones that you need to look at is war just an extension of that sort of competition that you see in capitalism. I read a really interesting story this morning that talked about how officials in the United States are very panicked that China is going to come up with a vaccination for coronavirus, and that they're going to give it away for free. And that has, pharmaceutical companies in a big panic, because, they're thinking of making a profit off this. But this is the kind of like dichotomy that I'm talking about that exists in the world, where, you've got people that say, this is a terrible thing that has beset humanity, and if we find a cure for this, we need to give it to everybody. And then the other side, where people say, this is a terrible thing that's beset humanity, I could make $1 billion off this. By creating intellectual property and putting a copyright on this, and then charging.
You're not talking about Bill Gates, are you?
Well, I mean, he's come under a lot of fire, recently, because he's been talking about, epidemics and pandemics and the importance of vaccination for a long time. But of course that, there are a lot of people in the medical community that are, somewhat nervous about over vaccination. I mean, I
Absolutely.
think that, you know,
I've been looking at that for a long time.
Yeah, there's probably a place for it, but at the same time,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to viruses, you want to be careful that you don't override your own body's ability to develop antibodies, you know, to various viruses. I mean, that's basically, and, you know, I've heard from some doctors that say that all this, you know, social distancing and not going outside and stuff is actually having the opposite effect. It's
I know.
suppressing our immune system. And of course, to the, you know, and I'm no expert on this, but to the extent that this is being done in order to generate profits for some pharmaceuticals that want everybody, you know, worried and want everybody vaccinated, then yeah, this would be a downside of capitalism that I think that, you know, none of us, you know, except for those who are, you know, making money in the pharmaceutical industry would think that was good for overall society.
Right. And you look at, you know, who owns big media. Not just owns, but who's, you know, the advertisers, who's paying for it. It's big pharma, you know.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
Can you hear that in the background?
A little bit.
Okay, it's a lawnmower. I'm going to shut the window real quick.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, as we move forward, as he gets up and you know, closes his window, I know it's like such a pleasure to reconnect with people that you haven't seen in a long time. And I know for me,
I totally forgot they come every Thursday.
I was just talking to the audience while you went over there.
Okay.
But I was saying, I know for me, it's been really nice to reconnect. And I do think that there is a greater good from all of this happening, because it is waking people up to the idea that a win-win situation is possible. The idea that you can structure business in a way that is for the greater good of everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the people that are convinced that the status quo has problems but doesn't necessarily need to be overthrown, I think, are holding on to that hope. And, you know, obviously, because, you know, we've seen progress in the past, that's certainly one possibility. And it's a possibility that I think a lot of people are hoping plays out, but we'll see. I mean, there's no way to tell, you know, whether this is going to go south or whether things are going to get better. And
right.
I'm hopeful that we can find a way out of this.
And when you really do look at the numbers, there was a study out of USC that shows that way more people had this thing. So it really, yeah, it does look like it's a different strand of what would be a really bad flu, but it's not as bad as what people were saying. And I know that people have died, and I'm not trying to be
no,
you know, like I
that.
definitely, yeah, I feel
Right.
for those people, and I'm not saying that, but on a systemic level, you know, you do have doctors like Dr. Bitar. I don't know if you've been familiar with him. And then
Yeah, I've seen some of his videos.
Yeah, and it really is kind of an awakening of consciousness, right? It's a feeling of, can you get to that peace and unattachment, and really not be so charged up, I think, is the key. And really, that's when you're in that state, then I feel like you're inspired to make the right move forward in the right way, as opposed to having that competition, you know, it's either me or them, you know, the Darwinism thing that like the strongest will survive, when in fact, you know, I don't buy into that, you know?
Yeah. Well, and, you know, once again, we're looking at this advancement in technology and travel, the globalization aspect that probably had something to do with it. You know, these sort of epidemics and pandemics, I think 150 years ago were largely localized because travel was so much more restrictive. I mean, yeah, I suppose if you got on a boat in China and came to the US, you know, you'd be dead before you infected anybody, you know, because it took a couple of weeks to get across the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
Now, you know, with modern travel, you know, you saw the outbreak in Italy and other places in Europe, and places like New York, where, you know, a lot of people, you know, travel to Europe and stuff like that. So yeah, this is all, I think, part and parcel to the modern world. I remember in the 1990s, I think in 1996, there was an author named Laurie Garrett who wrote a book called The Coming Plague, which I read in the 1990s. And it was interesting. And, you know, in the mid 90s, she was talking about exactly what we're going through now and connecting it to globalization and saying that this is, this is the type of thing that we're going to be seeing in the future. I think a lot of, when the book came out in the mid 90s, a lot of people called it scaremongering and said, oh, no, this lady doesn't know what she's talking about and so on and so forth. But, looking back on it now, it appears that she was largely correct. And like I said, I don't have a lot of expertise in medicine, but I have heard some doctors say that some of the advice that we're getting from government and other experts is actually counterproductive and might make it harder to get control over this.
Yeah.
virus.
Well, also I think we now have the ability to follow the money ourselves. I think before people just didn't question it because it was like, hey, if it's on TV, then it's true.
It's got to be true.
Got to be true. So I'm curious, what media do you watch? What media do you read? Are you one of those like, hey, I'll listen to any perspective? I know that you are because that's how you've always been. But yeah. I'm curious, are there platforms that you currently follow that you think you would suggest, for instance?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, I've always, when we study media in the government class, I've always made a distinction between mainstream or mass media and alternative media. And I think it's probably, if you have the time, and of course, this is always the problem, is that time is a very valuable resource. Yeah. But if you have the time, you want to read and watch as widely as you can. So for me, I think it is important to read liberal outlets like, the New York Times and the Washington Post and stuff like that. But it's also important to look at more right-wing outlets, and watch Fox News. It doesn't mean that you have to become, somebody that's like a devoted watcher. I still kind of click on it fairly frequently just to kind of see what is going on in that world. Okay.
Yeah.
But then I also, on my website, I offer, I have a link at the bottom called resource links, where I list alternative media sources where you can see stuff that's not produced by corporations or owned by wealthy individuals and that don't advertise. And I think those are really good sort of counter sources to read, what responses to what the mainstream and the mass media are telling people.
Yeah, absolutely. What independent sites do you suggest, or we could just send people to your website?
Yeah, my website is kropfpolisci.com, and that's KROPFPOLISCI.com. And then at the bottom, it's got my classes on it that I teach. And then at the bottom, it has a thing called resource links. And the first resources are alternative, in other words, non-corporate. And then I also have all the mass media links like Newsweek magazine and Time magazine and New York Times and all those. And then a whole lot of other ones that if you go even, below that. But I put the alternative ones first. And yeah, I've got some favorites. I really love Counterpunch. I think that they do a lot of really great stories. I've been with them for a long time. Mint Press News does really good stuff. Information Clearinghouse. So there's a whole bunch of them that Common Dreams that, typically give, more of a, I guess what you could call a true left-wing perspective, because in this country we call, anything that is, a tiny bit to the left of center, we call that left-wing, but I just call it liberal. And I think true left-wing is stuff that you won't typically see in the mainstream media. But like I said, I think it's important to look at all of it, because I think then you can get a clearer picture, I think, of, what's actually happened and determine for yourself, how, what you think is the best way to move forward on a lot of the problems that we face.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, we live kind of in a, we have a dual system. You're either a Republican or a Democrat. And I feel like that conversation is over here, but the real conversation is up here. And looking at the whole,
well,
I just don't think that
I would
they're
say
not
that,
really giving us the real choice. It's not real choice, in my opinion. I like collective evolution. I like Del Bigtree on, he has a High Wire, and he was an Emmy winning producer for The Doctors that he recognized. big pharma is controlling everything that, you know, and,
Right.
and there's good conversations. Don't get me wrong. There's great conversations that happens on the doctors. One of my clients is on the doctors regularly, but
Right.
he started his own webcast so that he can actually, you know, he gets paid directly from the consumer. And I feel like when you're getting paid directly from the consumer, you get to put your money where you think that the good reporting is.
Well, and that's alternative. That's the alternative sort of media that is kind of exploding right now. And I would add one thing, and that is that it doesn't appear that millennials and Gen Z have bought into the this two-party, two ideology dichotomy that a lot of boomers have. Okay,
right.
So that's the good news, is that, you know, when you talk to Gen Z, they don't even think of those terms. They're really just sort of like, well, you know, there's Democrats and Republicans, but that's my parents, and, you know, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. So
right.
Yeah. So and that's a good sign. That shows that in some ways this explosion of alternative media has had a good effect in that it's educating people to look at things in a different way, so that they don't just, you know, buy into this sort of this belief that there's only kind of two ways to look at the world and understand the world. So I would count that as a good thing.
Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating. I'm so happy that we were able to connect, and I really think that you know, it's just good to have that overall perspective. And I think a lot of people have taken your classes through the years, and I think that, you know, your opinion does matter. And I just thank you so much for doing this interview. I appreciate it.
Oh, are you kidding? It was my pleasure, Cassandra. And yeah, and I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing. I mean, I think you're at the tip of the spear. I mean, in terms of media and you know, getting the word out there about how the world works, and I think that's great. I'm really glad to see that you went into that. I was aware, by the way, that you had majored in this, because we were, I think, in contact briefly before you left DVC, and that you had told me at that time that this was something that you were thinking about doing.
Yeah.
So I'm just very, very pleased that you followed through on that and, you know, decided to go into this, because I think media is going to be a critically important aspect, you know, to moving forward, just because it's now so ubiquitous, and, you know, technology has made it so that, you know, all citizens can be journalists. And so that's, you know, and you're at the very tip of the spear at this, and I don't know, I mean, you know, it's one of those things where everything terrible that's going on right now, you'll still hear people say it's a great time to be alive. And I would agree with that, just because it's just cool to see, you know, so many young people kind of getting turned on to politics and what's going on in the world, and, you know, maybe taking control from a lot of these maniacs that have, you know, made some really poor judgments about,
Absolutely.
You know,
I totally agree with that.
and that's a bipartisan take too, because I would say that, you know, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, and I really believe it's the government itself that is the problem, and the people are the solution. How to, you know, the blueprint for how to do that is just not something that I have at the moment, or may never be able to develop. But in any case, it's probably not important anyway. And, you know, when you talk about, you know, people seizing control, that's what it really means. It doesn't mean that, you know, you vote for a Bernie Sanders, or, you know, some.
I know. I feel like they're all positioned so eloquently to make us think that it's a third-party person, and they're really just playing into the, you know.
The problem has always been in democracy that you develop this idea that there's some one person that can set all the problems that, you know, you have in democracies right. And nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at all the changes that in human life improvement, it's always been driven by the people themselves. Okay, and sometimes it's messy and sort of immature, and you know, there's bumps in the road, But everything good that I think that we've experienced has always come from the bottom up. And as people realize that democracy means you being involved, not you picking someone every 4 years and then letting them do all the work, but you being involved on a day-to-day basis, connecting with others, working in your community. It doesn't really matter whether it's socialism or capitalism. I think, community is the key thing. And I think, people are waking up to that, and that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just fascinating to kind of get your take because, I think there's a lot of conflict right now within families. And there's, even with my family, I was bringing some things up last year that they just were like, you're nutso, which is okay because, that's their decision to think that. And,
Sure.
I went on because if you weren't aware and watching some of this stuff kind of taking place, and there's, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but there's so much that is not seen to the naked eye in just reading the regular newspaper and watching the regular CNN. I was actually watching a CNN segment and they were like, these conspiracy theorists on YouTube. And I'm watching this on YouTube. I'm watching CNN on YouTube. Like now they have to compete with us,
Yeah. Well, and I don't think they like that.
No.
And as far as the family and the friends things go, I think that it's always important to see yourself as somebody who just plants seeds. You can never really get a person, to convert themselves. People have to convert themselves. You can't do that.
Yeah, and it's not really up to you. But to have a conversation, that's not.
It plants the seed.
Yes, and it's
right.
not. If we could just have a conversation and have it be like a peaceful conversation, even if we disagree. Right. That's really what it's all about. That's right. Real discourse.
No, that's true. And it's sometimes hard, especially to do with, when it comes to family, just because, you're so close to them that,
you're like, I want you to see what I'm seeing.
Right. Well, and any disagreement is always taken more personally, probably among family members than it would be, if you were arguing with someone that you didn't know. But I think it is important to plant those seeds, and I think it does work. In other words, I think that, people they need time to kind of process things. And I think one of the worst things you can do is to push too hard, because what that does is, people put up the wall and then everything that you say just sort of bounces off.
Right.
And,
exactly.
and you want it to be able to stick. And so, I think it's always good to, to listen. And also, another important component of this is to acknowledge that oftentimes, they're going to say stuff, plant seeds in your mind of stuff that you need to think about, not as a way to kind of better argue, but as to kind of see things from their point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, I would never say like, I'm right. It's more of like, whoa, have you seen all of these perspectives?
Correct.
Like,
right.
You're crazy for looking at that, because they're batshit crazy, and it's like, you know what? I'm the type that will pull up a random channel and watch somebody's perspective, even if I don't agree with it. I'm like, that's interesting. And then I go over here and I see their perspective. And in this environment where we're able to do that, why not take advantage of that?
Well, it's good for your brain too. I think that, to kind of see things from different points of view, I think expands your imagination in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and perception, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't worry about your family. I knew your pop way back when, and I had a conversation with him a while ago, and he sounds great and sounds like he's, kind of changed his mind about a lot of things.
Oh yeah, totally. No, my family's tight, but see, that's the thing. You can't let this stuff get in the way of your family. That's what matters the most.
No. It is really important to keep tight with your family. And I'm in a similar situation. I come from a family of very conservative people. And sometimes dinner table conversation can get a little weird, but
right.
I mean, I will say that after years and years of doing this, I think that I take all of this stuff a lot less seriously, at least with family, than I used to in the past. Yeah. And that's helped me to kind of to be able to go to family functions and holidays and stuff like that, and not let it get to me, and just sort of like, we'll agree to disagree and move on. So.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, when all this is over and I'm going to come to the Bay Area and we're going to throw a big pizza party, right? We'll just go to, or we could just go to the park and throw a kegger.
Yeah.
Do they do that anymore?
I haven't seen anybody doing that in a while, but I think that violates social distancing. So that's probably
well, you know,
why.
after the whole social distancing thing is up, but thank
No,
you so much.
I think that would be really wonderful. And yeah, we can get together and just kind of have our own reunion, I guess, and bring some of the gang from
CP, DVC.
Yeah, from CP, whatever. And,
yeah, Bay Area.
family. And yeah, I would really love that, Cassandra. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it's much needed.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And we'll put up your website so people can go to it.
Cool. Keep up the good work. And I hope to talk to you again soon, kid.
Thank you.